Author's note. I would like to remind the reader that nearly all of Professor Trelawney's predictions in canon came true, but almost never in the way anyone expected. Take from that what you will. Yes, Hermione's ruling planet really is Mercury, which is associated with intelligence and quick thinking, whether that matters in practice or not. Chapter 6, Herbs and Hexes. Hermione went down to breakfast the next morning tired and, if she were honest, more than a little cranky. How could she sleep after coming face to faces with that dog? The only good thing about the whole ordeal was the look on Draco Malfoy's face when he saw that Harry and Ron were still there, and even that was tempered by the fact that those two now seemed to think it had been a great adventure. Harry tried to tell Hermione about a little package that Hagrid had moved from Gringotts to Hogwarts and that he thought that's what the dog was guarding, but she didn't want to hear it. In fact, she picked up her plate and moved a few seats down. She was going to stay far away from those two nutters from now on, as they were sure to cause more trouble sooner or later. At least Dean Thomas was more or less normal. He even liked normal sports, like football. They had potions again this morning, and Hermione hoped she could still keep her head in that class after last night. Today's potions lesson was to brew the simplest of the various kinds of awakening potions, something she could use some of herself to start with. She was a little distracted, and she knew it, which didn't bode well either. She wanted to keep an eye on Neville and Seamus in case they blew something up again, and keep an eye on Harry and Ron in case they tried something, all while doing a good job with her own potion. Awakening potion. Huh? Dean said as Hermione started the burner. I thought we already had that. It's called coffee. Fortunately, Snape either didn't hear him, or chose to ignore it. Boil one small, greened potato for 15 minutes. Lavender read the first instruction. Because the greened potato had sprouted eyes, of course. Why are we cooking lunch here? Because greened potatoes are poisonous, and the heat neutralizes the poison, Hermione explained. Happy to see there were a few things Muggles knew better than wizards about potioning. Potions wasn't all that difficult in practical terms, Hermione decided. But she was quickly finding that it was her most conceptually challenging class, and the essays Snape assigned for homework bore that out. She had a pretty good idea of why each ingredient was included and some idea of the reasons for the order and the manner of preparation, but most of the stirring patterns still mystified her. There were few obvious reasons for the stirring patterns. In practical terms, stirring the potion more would result in more even heating of the liquid. Alternating clockwise and anti-clockwise stirs would create turbulence and mix the ingredients faster, while keeping in the same direction would mix them slower. The number of stirs was harder, although there were clear numerological elements to it. Many of the instructions said to stir 7 times, or for 7 minutes, or a multiple of 7. She could even understand the general principle of clockwise versus anti-clockwise. In the old days, anti-clockwise, that is, anti-sunwise, was considered unlucky. So it made sense that one usually needed to stir clockwise for positive effects and anti-clockwise for negative effects. But that didn't explain all of the switching off between the two, like alternating 3 times clockwise with once anti-clockwise. Or the straight back and forth stirs that they needed to do at one step. Or some of the more advanced potions in the book that required stirring in more complicated figure eights or trefoils or star shapes. Hermione didn't have a clue what the arithmantic foundations of those were, if they were arithmantic at all, though she wondered whether even fancier patterns like Lissajous curves and hypertrichoids would have any interesting effects. Still, just following the instructions shouldn't be that hard. They had just got done adding the sunflower petals, which, predictably, made the potion briefly glow the color of sunlight, and moved on to the dwarf bamboo leaves when they started to notice their potion was a little off. Hold on, is that supposed to happen? Hermione said after adding the leaves. The potion was much more faintly, but distinctly, glowing like sunlight. Dean checked the book. It doesn't say anything about glowing at this step. Then I wonder why. She was interrupted by a blinding flash followed by the sounds of people stumbling and a lot of cursing. She looked around for the source of the trouble, but she could only see spots in front of her eyes. When she could see again, she looked around to find Neville and Seamus, looking very embarrassed in front of a cauldron whose contents seemed to have caught fire. Imbeciles. Snape snapped at them as he drew his wand and dispelled the flames. The instructions clearly state to add 2 preparations of sunflower petals, not 3. You could have blinded someone with a stunt like that. 2 points from Gryffindor. The sunflower petals. Hermione whispered to Dean. But we only added 2 preparations, didn't we? Yeah, just the 2. What do you think happened? I'm not sure. Just a moment. Hermione pulled out 1,000 magical herbs and fungi to look up the ingredients. She hummed to herself as she found the correct page. There. Dwarf bamboo can grow in very low light and is extremely sensitive to sunlight. Of course, did you see how bright that flash was? The potion must be a lot more sensitive to the sunflower petals after adding the dwarf bamboo leaves. And that means... She grabbed a scraper from the preparation kit and scraped it across the cutting board. Sure enough, when she pulled it away, there was a bit of yellow residue on the blade. Oh, Dean made the connection. The leaves were contaminated with residue from the sunflowers. Exactly. We saw it doesn't take much. We should have cleaned off the cutting board, she said with annoyance. Now, we'll only get an E at best. Is there any way to fix it? He asked. She thought for a moment. She was sure there would be another dash of dwarf bamboo or an extra stir somewhere, but even the simplest modifications to potions were third-year material, and most were higher than that. She wasn't about to risk trying to guess it. Not that we could do now. We'll have to finish it as is and be more careful about cleaning everything next time. And she wrote in her notes to do just that. They added the blueberries to seal the potion and turned in their sample along with the rest of the class. The weekend passed quickly for Hermione. She started expanding her map, with her first priority being to pace off the whole non-forbidden part of the 3rd floor so that she could be sure not to run into that awful dog again. She also took the time to pace off some of the classrooms and was annoyed, though unsurprised, to find that the combined length was slightly longer than the length of the corridor they ran alongside. Between that, working on her homework, trying to avoid Harry Potter and all of the Weasleys, and venting her frustrations in a letter to her parents, mostly definitely not mentioning that dog. She'd rather not deliberately keep it from them, but you couldn't just go and say something like that. It took up most of her time that weekend, and before she knew it, she was back in her Monday classes. Not that she minded, of course. She was Hermione Granger, after all. The following Thursday was her birthday, but she wasn't expecting any special recognition, mostly because she hadn't got around to telling anybody about it. It seemed like a terribly awkward thing to slip into a conversation if one wasn't directly asked. It didn't improve her mood when she saw a team of 6 owls drop a large, suspiciously broomstick-shaped package in front of Harry Potter, but, of course, she was happy to see an owl head toward her that morning with a package from her parents. "Oh, today's your birthday," Parvati said when she saw the colorfully wrapped parcel. Hermione had been trying to stick close to Parvati and Lavender to avoid the boys, even though they rarely had much to talk about. "Aha, Hermione, why didn't you tell us?" "Happy birthday," she shrugged her shoulders. "Thanks, it just never came up." She unwrapped her package to find it was actually 2 presents. The first was a surprisingly large box of biscuits, and the second was a round, thick piece of plastic marked over with constellations. "Oh, wow, that's a really nice planisphere," she said. "A what?" asked Lavender. "A planesphere. Muggle astronomers use it. It's like a cross between an astrolabe and a star chart, for astronomy class," Hermione answered. "You see, you set the time and date like this, and it shows you the right star chart. Wow, that's really cool. I didn't know they'd come up with something like that." Hermione nodded and opened the attached letter. "Happy birthday, Hermione. We don't know if this will get to you on Monday or Thursday. We addressed it to be delivered on Thursday, but we don't know if Hogwarts will hold packages like that. Either way, have a great birthday. We thought your classmates might like to try a sample of our Muggle desserts, so we sent enough biscuits for you to share, and we know you were complaining about having to use astrolabes, so your father found a nice planisphere to help with your studies. We're sorry to hear some of your classmates are causing trouble. We're a little surprised about that Harry Potter. You wrote before that he didn't seem to let his fame go to his head. Anyway, it's probably best if you avoid those 2 when you can. And we're glad you didn't get in trouble, but you need to be more careful about getting locked out of your dorm. We hope your study group and your roommates will make better friends, though. You haven't told us much about them. Can you tell us what they're like? How they grew up? You probably know a lot more than we do about wizard families by now. Most everything's the same as always down here. We miss you, of course. Everyone asks us what you're up to, and we have to get a little creative with the answers. But we're so proud that you're doing just as well at magic as in Muggle classes. Keep up the good work. Love, Mum and Dad. She put the letter down, a little ashamed that she hadn't got to know the people around her better. Between schoolwork and trying to avoid certain people, she hadn't put much effort into getting close to any others. Plus, small talk had never been her strong suit, and being raised in a different culture didn't make things any easier. Although for that day, she learnt, sharing the Muggle biscuits did help some. The following Saturday, she went back to pacing off the West Wing, spending the morning heading down from the part she had explored before. 3rd floor, 2nd floor, 1st floor, ground floor. She paced off the Great Hall and the entrance hall before finding the door that lead down to the dungeons. And that's when the trouble started. The above-ground part of the castle was straightforward enough, if a bit peculiar, but the below-ground part was a labyrinth. Dark, old corridors cut through the cold stone seemingly at random, lined with storage rooms and unused classrooms and apartments and actual dungeon cells that probably hadn't been occupied in centuries. The place seemed to be constantly lit as if it were late at night and carried such a heavy air of creepiness that she wondered if it might have been intended to scare off non-Slytherins. She wasn't too worried about the labyrinth itself. She was making a map, after all. And if she did get lost, she could always brute force it by only turning right until she got back to where she came in. No, the corridors weren't the problem. It was the people. She knew the dungeons were mostly the Slytherins' domain. She had been hoping to not meet any more people on her explorations so that she wouldn't have to explain what she was doing, again, but it was not to be. As she went deeper and deeper into the bowels of the school, she heard a voice call out behind her. Quite possibly the voice she was least hoping to hear. Granger. What are you doing here? It was Draco Malfoy. She kept pacing. I know it's you. I'd know that ridiculous bushy hair anywhere. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Granger. Hermione slowly turned around, clutching her sketchbook tight to her chest, trying to reach for her wand without being too conspicuous about it. She hadn't forgotten the rumors about Malfoy being practiced with a few choice curses. He was not someone she wanted to meet in a dark corridor, which was exactly what she was doing. So that's what you're up to, he said triumphantly. Snooping around trying to find our common room. She tried to keep her voice even. No, Malfoy, I was just. Oh, I know what you say you're doing, he sneered. Everyone's laughing about it. The little buck-toothed Muggle-born girl thinks she's going to make a map of the castle. As if anyone can do that. I see can, she defended herself. It's not quite to scale, B, but everyone was laughing about it. Malfoy slowly stalked closer to her. She started backing away. You'd better learn your place, Granger. Bad things happen to people who don't. P please, she stammered. This is a P public area. I'm just trying to learn my way around. He came right up to her. Now. Well, then, let's see what you've been working on. If you're not causing any trouble. He grabbed the top of her notebook and tried to pry it from her grasp. No. She pulled it back, affording him only a glimpse of the map she was making of the dungeon. He grabbed it again. Give it here. Malfoy spat. He yanked it out of her hands and inspected it. Aha! He gloated. I think I'll just take care of this for you. He ripped the map of the dungeon off the pad and started to crumple it up in one hand. No. She yelled again, lunging to try to get it back. There was a flurry of swinging arms as Malfoy tried to smack her away and Hermione tried to block him. By accident, she happened to land a decent slap on his face, which distracted him long enough for her to grab both her notebook and the loose page and run away. Unfortunately, Malfoy didn't take kindly to that. You'll pay for that, mudblood, he shouted. Locomotor wibbly. An instant later, Hermione felt her legs collapse out from under her, and she went sprawling painfully on the floor. Malfoy strolled up to her, smirking to himself, undoubtedly with his wand at the ready. Hermione Granger wasn't a fighter. She'd dealt with a few bullies in her time, but it was mostly by ignoring them. She certainly wasn't used to them hexing her in the back. She wasn't one to break rules in general, much less get into an actual fight, but the sound of the boy standing over her, laughing almost leeringly at her prone form, awoke something new in her, a visceral anger mingled with a desperate need for escape. If this boy was going to start breaking the rules and hexing her in the corridor, then maybe it was time she fought back. She didn't know many strong spells yet that she was certain she could cast just now, but she could at least shoot sparks at him. She got hold of her wand and clutched it tight in her hand. She'd only get one shot, but if she could hit him in the face. Hey! What's going on down here? Hermione looked up to see an older boy heading toward them from around the corner ahead, and thanked God when she saw he wore yellow-trimmed robes and a prefect's badge. Her thoughts of hexing Malfoy back were completely forgotten. Malfoy stopped. "What are you doing here?" "Truman," he said with unmasked annoyance. "Hufflepuffs use this level too," the prefect said. "Now what's going on here, Mr. Malfoy?" The younger boy grumbled a bit and then answered, "Miss Granger tripped. I was just helping her." She staggered to her feet and spun around to face him. "You were not?" "You," but she stopped when she saw the hatred in his eyes. And she remembered her mother's advice. Just ignore them, and they'll move on. She hung her head and turned around. "Thank you," she muttered to the prefect. "I'll help you find your way out of here, Miss Granger," Truman said. "Stay out of trouble, Mr. Malfoy." The prefect led her out by way of the corridors near the Hufflepuff dorms, eventually coming out at the below-ground part of the grand staircase. Even in her dejected state, Hermione kept count of her footsteps so that she could recreate this path on her map afterwards. She would consider whether to risk the dungeons again some other time. She wished things wouldn't be so divisive around here, especially around lines of blood status, but she supposed there were prejudices and rivalries in every school. The one thing that confused her in this, though, was what Malfoy had called her, mudblood. She'd heard people talking about purebloods and half-bloods, so it wasn't hard to guess the meaning, but she'd never heard that word before. And somehow, it didn't seem like the kind of thing to bring up just now with the prefect. She filed it away to look up in the library later. It was bad enough that Malfoy had just taken her down like that. She at least wanted to know how offended she should be. To round out the morning, and to get her mind off the dungeons, she decided to start in on the other towers in the West Wing. She couldn't get into Ravenclaw Tower, and the grand staircase would be a whole morning to try to navigate by itself. So she found herself climbing up higher and higher in the North Tower, wondering what was even up there if it wasn't dorms, since most of the staff apartments were either in the main part of the West Wing or off the grand staircase. She was glad she'd already mapped out the rest of the West Wing. Even in something as simple as a rectangle, all the hidden doors and moving staircases made it tricky to find her way to the North Tower, and the tower itself climbed all backwards like Cirith Ungol, with no real rhyme or reason. And then a painting of a little knight who couldn't swing a sword straight started shouting challenges at her until she explained that she was on a quest to explore the entire castle. Finally, she came to a landing that from the count of the stairs was probably 2 floors below the top of the tower, and the staircase ended. At first, she thought there was nothing up here, but she happened to look at the ceiling. There was a circular trapdoor there with a brass plaque on it like the ones the rest of the professors had on their office doors. It read, "Sybil Trelawney, Divination Teacher. This is an office." Hermione mused. "I wonder how you get up there." The trapdoor swung open, and a silver ladder descended to the floor. "You ask it." "Of course you do." She shrugged her shoulders, tucked her sketchbook under her arm, and climbed up the ladder. She arrived at the top and found not an office, but what had to be a classroom, though it looked more like an abandoned tea shop. It was stiflingly hot, the air was thick with perfume and incense, and the entire room was dim and lit with red. 23 little tables were squeezed into the room with twice as many chintz armchairs and matching poof ottomans, so that there was barely room to turn around. "Oh my. Hello, what are you doing up here?" said a soft, ethereal-sounding, thickly accented voice. A tall, spindly woman climbed down another ladder from above. Hermione thought the woman looked and sounded like a stereotypical Eastern European fortune teller, crossed with a dressed-up praying mantis. She had frizzy, dirty blonde hair that stuck out everywhere even more than Hermione's own. She wore a spangled shawl and excessive amounts of costume jewelry and glasses so thick that you could start a fire with them. She smelled distinctly of sherry under all the perfume. I was just exploring the castle," she said nervously. Are you Professor Trelawney?" "Yes, dear, I am." "And who might you be?" "I'm Hermione Granger." She couldn't resist. She'd heard some about this teacher from Alicia. "If you teach divination, didn't you see me coming?" "I see many things," Trelawney said, with an eerie wave of her hands, "but not all may be interpreted. But come in, now. Let me see." Precocious and inquisitive of mind, a wanderer far from the common path. "Were you perhaps born under Mercury?" I don't know, Professor. My birthday was on Thursday." "Yes, Virgo, a child of Mercury, indeed." The off-kilter way Trelawney stared at her through those magnifying glasses made Hermione rather uncomfortable. Do you live up here, Professor? But of course, my apartment is just upstairs. Like you, I find that descending into the crowds of the main school clouds the inner eye. I'm not sure I have the inner eye. Hermione started. But you keep to yourself. And you are separate from all others, Trelawney continued. Not really. Hermione said self-consciously. But the divination teacher kept going. Oh, I sense great changes coming for you, dear. You will find the prize you are seeking in November. What? I'm not seeking a prize, but in the spring, one of your number will be sacrificed. What number? I don't have a number. I think you must be mistaken, Professor, she said nervously, backing toward the ladder. Oh, those who have the sight will know it. Trelawney said. Yeah, I think I'll stick with arithmantic projections, Mom. Numbers cannot convey the full experience of the inner eye, child. Well, maybe not, but, at least we know what we're talking about. Goodbye, Professor, I have to go. Hermione reached the trapdoor and scrambled down the silver ladder, her heart pounding. Had she really just talked back to a teacher like that? Yes, she had. Professor Trelawney did not seem like the kind of teacher she would get along with, and she didn't need the sight to see that. She barely noticed that she hadn't had a chance to pace off the classroom. Then again, it was too crowded with furniture to do it. Anyway, still, she was a bit troubled as she returned to the more traveled parts of the castle. The woman may have been little better than a muggle fortune teller, but her words, "You are separate from all others," hit a little too close to home. It wasn't just maths that set her apart around here. The culture gap alone put her in a small minority, and she was more of a natural loner than she really liked to admit. It was so hard to relate to most of the people in the castle, she decided to call it a day after that and head back to the common room. She started wondering what she was going to write to her parents tomorrow. As much as it pained her, she felt like most of today's events were once again things that were probably best left out of her letters. Getting hexed in the back by a rich, privileged bigot wouldn't play too well with her parents, and Professor Trelawney was just too weird to bring up. Her roommate's advice, just stay away from the Slytherins, was decidedly unhelpful. It certainly didn't address the root problem. But she had to admit she didn't have anything better to work with at the moment. Chapter 7. The Great Tower. The equation on the board read x equals a, b, bc, b. Now, given the rules of symbol manipulation, what is the simplest way to express the value of x? Professor Vector asked. Mr. Montague? The Slytherin boy thought for a moment. He was pretty bright, but like a majority of the class, he had been mystified when the numbers vanished from the equations entirely. A minus c divided by b? He said uncertainly. No, Mr. Montague. Mr. Diggory? Cedric didn't look much better off. He scratched a few symbols on his parchment and said, a minus b minus c divided by b. No, that's not it either, Miss Granger. Ha. Oh. A minus b plus c over b, she said quickly, snapping out of her daze. Correct, Vector said. Miss Granger, I'm aware you had astronomy last night, but I do expect you to stay awake in my class. Yes, Professor, she said sheepishly. A few people snickered behind her, and even the other members of her study group looked torn between being amused at her embarrassment and amazed that she could correctly answer a question the rest of them could barely understand without missing a beat, even while she was half asleep. Hermione had stopped bothering to raise her hand in Arithmancy class pretty quickly, at least when it came to the maths lessons. Sometimes, Professor Vector would call on her after a couple of her classmates had got a question wrong. And sometimes she would just work it out on the board. The trouble was that this wasn't how Hermione was used to doing things, and on Thursdays, it could be difficult to stay awake if she wasn't adequately engaged. The worst part, though, was it wasn't just Thursdays anymore. While the weekly 2 o'clock jaunts for astronomy class affected her worst, she was having trouble sleeping in general, staying up much later than she ought to reading every other night. It had started as an effort to try to learn more about the magical world so she could relate better, but it was fast turning into just a plain old bad habit. While she was all but lost in thought, Professor Vector worked through the steps of simplifying the equation on the board to demonstrate her answer and then called on Alicia. Miss Spinnet, would you care to solve this equation for b? Alicia quickly, but very carefully, scribbled out the steps on her parchment, muttering to herself. A plus C divided by X plus 1. Correct. Alicia looked quite pleased with herself, as did Hermione, seeing that she had got the point across to at least one member of her study group. She had to stifle a laugh a moment later when someone asked if it was magic that made the numbers appear and disappear from the equations like that. It was odd the way some people thought about magic when they were raised with it. It was a chilly, foggy autumn day, the kind of day that made one glad of the thick, woolen Hogwarts robes. Sitting out here in the viaduct courtyard, everything was quiet and still. Even the birds were eerily silent in the fog. The loudest sounds were the whisper of autumn leaves and the scratching of her mechanical pencil. Hermione gazed up at the exterior of the castle and carefully sketched what she saw. This would be her first sketch of the outside of the castle to send to her parents, and she could see a fair bit from here. The entrance hall, the Great Tower, the whole face of the West Wing, and several of the towers of the East Wing. But she paid particular attention to the Great Tower, the huge column that housed the grand staircase. She had finished breakfast quickly that morning to get an early start exploring the space around largest and most complicated of Hogwarts's 142 staircases. She started from the lowest part she could get to, the dungeon level, and worked her way up. There was a large set of doors on the dungeon level that indicated the staircase went lower, but they were locked. She hesitated there, about to head back up, but something stopped her. It wasn't like anyone else followed the rules around here. She approached the doors, checked to make sure no one was around, then discreetly drew her wand and whispered, "Alohomora." The doors didn't budge. Oh well, it was worth a try. Though it did make her wonder why the third-floor corridor wasn't protected by something stronger. Maybe someone had to feed the dog? She shuddered at the thought. With 3 large, interlocking squares of rises and landings, there were lots of different ways for the stairs to go, and some part or other of the grand staircase was always in constant motion. She had to stop at one point when the flight she was on changed to connect to the forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor and wait for it to change back. That wasn't a mistake she was going to make again. She counted the steps going up, making note of each room around the staircase, but as soon as she hit the 8th floor, above the entrance to Dumbledore's office, things started to turn strange. First, the complex interlocking and changing staircases shrank down to a single square. It was still 20 steps on a side, but it later narrowed to 15, then 10 as she ascended. The rooms off the staircase were also smaller here, and most of them seemed to be unused, while the few that were seemed to be either storage for specialized items or contained unusual experiments, presumably of Dumbledore's, unless any of the other professors worked on such oddities as inside-out clocks and upside-down fountains up here. On the 17th floor, the portraits started to look off. They looked fuzzy and distorted, as if they were copies of copies. The figures no longer spoke to her, and they moved in strange, jerky ways. Around the same time, the neat, cut stones of the walls became more and more irregular until they were little more than a rubble of rocks held together by mortar. A few floors later, the square staircase changed into a tighter spiral staircase, but the steps were crooked, and from counting the steps, she was sure she ought to be about 50 feet above the top of the tower by now. She couldn't see how much higher the stairs went because of how the tower tapered, but she kept seeing a floor or two above her, so she kept going. There were still rooms up here, if one could call them that. They were all about 8 feet wide and between 8 and 16 feet long. She made careful note of each one in her notebook, but she could barely describe them. They looked like random fragments of rooms from elsewhere in the castle. A classroom with only 3 desks in it, a bedroom with barely enough room for a single bed. Some rooms had copies of the odd experiments she had seen below, but they were broken copies. They might have gears that would jam or pipes that just circled and never attached to anything. There were little windows, too, windows that appeared to look out from the correct height, well above the roof of the castle. But later, looking up at the tower from the courtyard, she saw something she had never noticed before. Row upon row of little windows that grew ever smaller and closer together until she couldn't see them from this distance. It looked as if no matter how strange the castle became, its topology stayed the same. A window on the inside always matched up with a window on the outside. There was something comforting in that thought. At least the castle obeyed some rules. Oh, but it was strange. As Hermione had climbed even higher, things became even more twisted. The portraits soon looked like moving modern art, and many of them weren't rectangular and were missing parts of their frames. Things started not to be made of the right materials. One stair step might be wood and another steel, and they were sometimes so crooked that she could barely climb them. A few were missing altogether. The ever-lit torches that lit the stairs might be made of copper or clay instead of wood, but they still burned, at least the ones that didn't have their heads embedded in the wall. She even passed a suit of armor made of porcelain that had 4 arms. And there were doors made of glass, doors installed sideways, and doors so oddly shaped that it would be almost impossible to crawl through them. She started avoiding the shadowy corners, since she more than once found them home to overgrown spiders and other bugs, and in one case, a very large bat that thankfully flew down and away. The tower continued to narrow so that the rooms became only about 4 feet wide, and by now they were filled with things that made no sense. Here there would be half of a desk, balancing impossibly on 2 legs. There, a chair with its legs installed upside down, making it unusable. There again, a whole bed, but made entirely of leather and attached sideways to the wall because it was the only way it would fit. All 3 might be in the same room if it was long enough, and she was sure that the rooms had taken to changing whenever she turned her back. Eventually, everything just seemed to melt together. She could feel the magic twisting around her. The stairs were still more or less usable, but everything else, wall, door, room, window, and furniture, all looked like a hodgepodge, as if someone had taken bits of everything in the castle and thrown it all in a blender. To the extent that there were rooms, they looked more like closets. She tried one door that looked like the door to a kitchen cupboard, and inside a little cubby hole found a small window and what she realized was supposed to be a bed. The mattress was the right thickness, but it was the size of an ottoman and had sheets made of very thin layers of stone. In place of a headboard was a fragment of a chair, correctly made of wood, but with its 2 legs tied into knots. One of the legs ended in a working hot water tap from which the water fell upwards, and the other supported a bit of disembodied gearwork that appeared to be cut from portrait canvas and had splashes of color flickering across it. From the view out the window, it looked like she was well over 400 feet in the air, twice the height of the entire castle. There weren't any torches at that height, thankfully. Who knew what would happen if they got thrown in the magical blender? The only light came from windows that cut past the rooms, directly into the staircase. After looking at the odd bed thing, she heard a noise up ahead, a high-pitched chirping like a birdsong. She moved up toward the noise, but when she did, a mouse the size of an Irish terrier leapt out of one of the cubbyholes, took one look at her, squealed like a pig, and bolted up the stairs. Hermione ran screaming all the way back down the tower. It was only by a miracle that she didn't trip on any crooked or missing stairs. She was done. There was no top of the tower, she was sure about it now. It just kept climbing higher and higher and got smaller and smaller until it dissolved into atoms and pure magic, and she was sure she would be eaten by a giant cockroach long before then. She didn't stop until she had run down the 300 feet of steps back to the 7th floor, where she very nearly collided with Albus Dumbledore as he was exiting his office. She hadn't had cause to meet the headmaster in person, yet, and this was not the way she wanted to do it. This was the chief warlock, supreme mugwump, and defeater of Grindelwald for Pete's sake. And here she was, sweating, unkempt, scared out of her wits, and so out of breath that she found herself slumping against the wall to keep her feet. But Albus Dumbledore only looked concerned at the state of his young student. "Miss Granger?" he asked. "Whatever is the matter?" I was up there, and there was a..." Hermione tried to articulate between breaths, pointing upward. The headmaster's face became more worried. "Up in the tower? How high up did you go?" Way above the top, sir," she stammered. "There was a big mouse. She held her hands a couple of feet apart to indicate the size. "Oh dear, that high? Miss Granger, I think you'd better go see Madame Pomfrey for a calming draught. And in the future, you should not venture any higher than the top of the tower ought to be without the help of a professor." She nodded profusely. "Yes, sir, however," Dumbledore said with a smile, "it is rare to see such curiosity about the castle from the students." His eyes twinkled a bit as he continued, 5 points to Gryffindor for your initiative." Hermione's mouth hung open for a minute until she came to her senses and squeaked, "Thank you, Professor," before dashing off toward the hospital wing. That hadn't exactly been the best way to start the day. After Madame Pomfrey had given her a calming draught, and some lunch, given the time, she headed out to the relative safety of the outside of the castle for a nice, normal afternoon alone sketching whatever she could see. That seemed to be the way things ended up on the weekends. Hermione wasn't ashamed of liking her peace and quiet, but it did feel a bit isolating at times. No one was likely to be out here on a Saturday, out on the training grounds, maybe, but not here, overlooking the lake. Hermione. Her head snapped in the direction of the sound. Dean? What are you doing out here? Dean Thomas was strolling toward her across the courtyard. I was gonna draw some pictures of the castle for my folks, he said. Really? That's what I'm doing. Oh. I didn't know you were an artist, too. I'm not, she said quickly. I just know enough geometry to manage with buildings. He sat down on the bench next to her. All right, then, let's see what you've got. She slowly turned over her sketchbook to show him, nervous about having her work analyzed by an actual artist. It's not bad, Dean said. Shading needs some work, and I don't know if you were really going for the fine detail like the ivy and stuff. He flipped back to the previous pages. What's this? Hermione snatched the sketchbook back defensively. I was trying to map out the grand staircase, she said. It didn't go well. Oh, sorry. The two of them sat mostly in silence as they sketched, neither one wanting to say much after that, although Dean gave her a few drawing tips. She felt uncomfortable about snapping at him, but she wasn't ready to talk to anyone about her little adventure just yet. When she thought she was more or less done, she gave him a somewhat awkward goodbye and headed back inside. Today, we will begin our first unit on untransfiguration, Professor McGonagall began. Because transfiguration can be quite error-prone, it is vital to know how to reverse a transformation. This is a complex art in itself, which requires a mastery of a number of different spell tools, depending on whether the transfiguration is permanent or not, how much you know about the original form, and whether there are any other spells applied, especially form-locking spells. Now, for many temporary transfigurations, like most of what you've been doing so far, a simple finite incantatum will suffice, but this will not work on stronger or more permanent transfigurations, and at the same time, it will cancel many other charms and spells that you may not want to. So we will begin with the most general untransfiguration spell for when the original form of the object is known, reparafage, so that you will be able to reverse your own work if you make a mistake. Professor McGonagall looked pointedly at Hermione at the next part, as she often did when explaining the more esoteric points of her subject. Reparafage is approximately the arithmantic inverse of the general free transfiguration spell, which makes it effective at reversing a wide range of transfigurations, but not as powerful. And just as free transfiguration requires one to hold the target form clearly in mind, the inverse spell, reparafage, requires one to hold the original form clearly in mind. Hermione was surprised to find she didn't know that bit. Numerology and Grammatica spoke much more about charms and jinxes than about transfiguration, something she considered a bit of an oversight. She knew the principle, of course, even if she didn't know the breakdown for that particular spell. Take a reciprocal of the arithmantic elements and build the spell from the first few algebraic terms, probably just the first two terms. She suspected that a spell this low level would only be a first-order approximation. She eagerly wrote down in her notes Professor McGonagall's explanation and a few of her own speculations and questions based on it. As usual, she was the first to get the new spell to work, successfully untransfiguring her oak leaf back into a quill. She tried to help Harry Potter with his spell, since she'd wound up sitting next to him, but she didn't think he seemed too interested in her help. Miss Granger, McGonagall called to her after class was over. Yes, Professor. The headmaster informed me about your little excursion in the upper levels. Oh, she said nervously. While I admire your perseverance in exploring the castle, I agree with him that you should be more careful. Magic can be unpredictable at times. If things start to turn strange, well, stranger than usual, it's best to turn back sooner rather than later. Yes, Professor, she said, slightly downcast, and left the room. Hermione wandered the grounds for a while to find a good vantage point from which to sketch the back side of the west wing. Heading out from the clock tower, past the little practice stone circle that the advanced students used once in a while, she headed down the path toward the groundskeeper's hut. It was down at a lower elevation than she would have liked, but it would do. She was nearly there when the huge groundskeeper himself stepped out from behind a pile of pumpkins that were somehow as supersized as he was. Well, hello, there, he called out jovially. I weren't expectin' company today. Hello, Mr. Hagrid, Hermione replied timidly. Or, yeah, can you call me Hagrid? Fraid I don't quite remember your name, though, he said. It's Hermione, sir. Hermione Granger. Well, good to meet yeah. Hermione, Hagrid said. And what a year up to out here today. I'm drawing a picture of the castle for my parents. This looked like a good place to do it, if that's all right. Well, of course it is. It's got a nice view, don't it? Come on, make yourself at home. Thank you, Hagrid. Hermione sat on the large front porch of the hut and took out her notebook. It's nice having company out here, Hagrid mused. I don't see too many o' the younger students. Of course, Harry Potter and his friend, Ron, come by every so often. Yeah, know them? Hermione resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Yeah, we've met, she said. You couldn't escape knowing all about Harry Potter, as much as the boy tried himself. It made her feel a little sorry for him, when she wasn't busy being annoyed at him and Ron, but Hagrid seemed to like them, like many people. Good blokes, those two, he rambled on. Course, I had to pick up Harry from his relatives this summer. Phew. Nastiest bunch o' muggles I ever met. Really? She squeaked. That was news to her. Oh, yeah. You should have heard what they were saying about his parents and about Dumbledore. They hadn't even told him what had happened to his parents. Hermione quietly stopped sketching. That didn't sound like the Harry Potter she knew, usually looking happy, doing okay in classes, nice enough most of the time, but annoyingly not afraid to get into trouble, especially around Malfoy. Although it might explain why he never talked about his family, when Ron and everybody else did, even Hermione herself, if you asked her. As if on cue, Hagrid said, Mind yeah, most muggles are pretty decent folks. Your parents are muggles, aren't they? They're dentists, she said absently as she started drawing again. Dentists? What's that? Did nobody in the magical world know what a dentist was? They're like healers, except they only work on teeth. Huh, funny how they do things out there. Hermione found it was strangely pleasant talking to someone who had no idea who she was, about nothing in particular. In every school she attended, her reputation as a maths whiz ran ahead of her within a few days, but Hagrid didn't seem to be in the loop, or perhaps he just didn't remember. That wouldn't surprise her, so ye have been spending your Saturdays exploring the castle on your own. Hagrid said as she explained what she'd been doing, more or less. It's hard when some parts of the castle don't make normal sense, at least by Muggle standards. But I've been through most of the parts that students are allowed in by now. He said, impressed. Must get lonely, though, don't it? Hermione froze up. The truth was that she was getting lonely on these excursions. She hardly ever saw anyone out here, Dean once in a while, but they never had much to say to each other, which was a little odd, considering he was Muggle-raised. And so much of the rest of the time, she was in schoolwork mode and didn't really have much occasion to talk to people. She was starting to see the pattern, but this yet one more thing she wasn't sure how to talk to anyone about, including her parents. It can be, she admitted. I see Dean Thomas out here drawing sometimes, but there's not many people interested in this kind of thing. I think I've got most of the drawings I want done, though, well, don't worry. I'm sure you'll find some good friends in there. Always a pretty good lot. The students, most of them. Yeah, sure. She kept sketching, not letting Hagrid see her face. As she was putting the finishing touches on her drawing, something struck her, something she couldn't believe she'd never noticed before. Hagrid? She asked. Yeah. What's above the Great Hall? What's above where? Look. She pointed up at the castle. Above the Great Hall, there's 3 rows of windows and 3 small towers. I'm sure they're not visible on the inside. They must be above the enchanted ceiling. Do you know what's up there? Hagrid stroked his wild beard in thought. Can't say I do. Never paid much attention to that before. Don't think anyone ever goes up there. Was it just her, or were there a lot of things about Hogwarts that nobody ever paid attention to? Then again, the castle was 1,000 years old, and Hagrid was only the groundskeeper. Maybe one of the professors would know. Nope. Nobody really did pay attention to what the castle looked like. Professor Vector said she'd never thought about what was above the Great Hall and had never heard of anyone using that space. Professor Binns was sadly useless, as usual, as was, more surprisingly, Hogwarts, a history. And she didn't feel comfortable asking Professor McGonagall after the Grand Staircase fiasco, which was silly, she thought. It was a perfectly reasonable question. It was just the way everyone else seemed to ignore it that made her feel like it was taboo or something. And Professor McGonagall just didn't seem to be the one to approach for that. In a normal school, this wouldn't have been a difficult question. But then again, in a normal school, a lot of things that had already happened to her this year wouldn't have happened. And the students were no help, either. Of her study group, Cedric was the only one who had even noticed the rows of little windows. She tried the prefects all the way up to 7th year, too, and none of them knew what was up there either. Much less how to get there. Hermione sighed softly. Perhaps it was time she took more drastic action. She'd rather not go there, but she had to admit it probably would work. Hey, Hermione, someone interrupted her thoughts. Huh? Oh, hi, Parvati, she said, seeing her roommate sit beside her on the sofa in the common room. So I haven't seen you much lately. Where do you go all the time? The library, mostly. I like to get my homework done early. And then read for a while. Well, I guess that's good if you can. You should come and hang out with me and Lavender sometimes, though. Oh, what do you do together? You know, just talk. Or we could do your hair, Parvati offered. Hermione slumped back on the sofa and sighed loudly. She'd never had a single female friend who hadn't offered to do that at least once. She didn't particularly like her bushy hair, but she didn't have time to get it under control every morning. Or, if she was brutally honest, she rarely wanted to take the time, like other girls did. Sorry. Just talk, then. Parvati backed off. I don't know. I've never been good at that either. What do normal girls talk about, anyway? Boys, Quidditch stars, family, other girls. Whatever's in Witch Weekly. How much we hate our teachers. I like most of my teachers, Hermione protested. Besides, we have all but one of the same ones. Well, there's other things. Listen, how about I loan you my copy of Witch Weekly? Then you'll at least know what's going on. Ah, sure, thanks, she said unenthusiastically. Great. She tried reading Parvati's copy of Witch Weekly that evening. She really did. But she gave up halfway through. She just couldn't slog through all of those gossip columns. It didn't help that she didn't even know who Gwenog Jones was. Much less why she should care about her correspondence with Curly Duke of the Weird Sisters. She didn't care for that in the Muggle world, and here was no different. What did she talk about with her friends back at home, besides school, anyway? Books? Movies? Sure, there was a fair bit of that. But most people in the magical world didn't even know who Tolkien was, let alone Arthur Clarke, and they'd certainly never seen a Muggle film, any more than she'd seen a magical play. Relationships? Well, they were starting to in secondary school, but she'd been out of her element there, too. Honestly, Hermione liked maths, science fiction, fantasy, chess, classical music, history. She could find other girls like that in the Muggle world, but at Hogwarts, at best, she was in the wrong house for that. When it came down to it, she just had to admit that she had almost nothing in common with Lavender or Parvati. And Lily and Sally Ann weren't much better. They mostly just hung out with each other, and she rarely saw them outside of class since they were both even more morning people than she was. She was starting to wonder if the Sorting Hat had been right not to put her in Ravenclaw. Meanwhile, her lingering problem of figuring out what was above the Great Hall was still tugging at her mind, and she was rapidly coming to the conclusion that she had only one useful resource left. Well, this was it, she thought. This was her last, best hope for solving the mystery. It was risky, but if she was a Gryffindor, she might as well put it to some use. Hello, Fred, George, she said uneasily when she caught the Weasley twins in the common room. Why, hello, Miss Granger. What can we do for you? One of the red-haired boys said. Probably Fred. She was starting to notice that Fred was the more outgoing of the two and more often the first to speak. Ah, you two know a lot about the castle, right? Do we know a lot about the castle, Fred? The second twin said, laughing. I'd say we know a fair bit, George. Trying to find a way to sneak out, are we? No. I was just wondering if you could tell me what's above the Great Hall. They stared at her in confusion. Come again? George said. There are 3 rows of little windows above the Great Hall. I was wondering what's up there. Even Professor Vector didn't know. Now the twins stared at each other. I never noticed that, George said. Me neither, Fred replied. I've never seen them mentioned anywhere. Do you think we should check with George lowered his voice. Yes, I think we should. Miss Granger, could you give us a few minutes while we check our sources? Oh, sure. Come on, George, let's go. They dashed up the staircase to their dorm room. Hermione wondered what that was all about. If she found out those two had had a map this whole time, she would. Well, she wasn't sure what she would do yet, but she'd at least reconsider her stance of not antagonizing them. Up in their room, Fred and George quickly made sure there was no one inside, shut the door, and took out their most prized possession, the Marauder's map. The Marauder's map was one of the most impressive bits of Charm's work they had ever seen. They'd filched it from Filch in their first year, from his confiscated and highly dangerous file, no less. At first, they'd thought it was just a piece of parchment Charm to make snarky comments at people, but, apparently sensing the presence of a couple of pranksters, it had led them on until they'd discovered the passphrase. I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. They spoke the passphrase now, and the map came to life, drawing in the names of Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. Those great unknown patrons of magical mischief makers. It was a complicated piece of work. The map unfolded to about 3 feet wide, and even then, the little dots that represented the occupants of the castle were barely bigger than periods. At mealtimes, the Great Hall was just a jumbled mess of names in between long rows of dots, but it was surprisingly easy to use. The map was laid out like a book, with the west wing on the left-hand page and the east wing on the right-hand page. The front cover showed the title and a stylized representation of the grounds. The first spread was the dungeons, with some cutaways for the storage rooms under the dungeons. The next was the ground floor, then the first floor, and so on, up to the 7th floor. Finally, the 9th spread and the back cover were covered in dozens of little circles, cross-sections of all the towers all the way up to the top of the astronomy tower. Finding a person in all those pages could be difficult, but finding a place should have been easy. Yet even though they checked all the levels just to be sure, they found their memories were accurate. The building that housed the Great Hall was only drawn on the spread for the ground floor. "Huh, that is odd," Fred said. "I know I've seen those windows, but they're not on the map." "I know," said George. "Maybe the marauders never went up there." "Blasphemy!" his twin exclaimed. "Burn the blasphemer. It would make sense." Though, George laughed. "Not much reason to go there if no one ever uses it. And if even some of the professors don't know, they really might not have thought about it." "Wow, I think that girl's really going places." "Oh, yes, brother. Merlin help us all if she ever turns that mind of hers to pranking. Any ideas how to get up there, now?" "Well, there must be a door off the Great Hall or the entrance hall somewhere, but I wouldn't know where to look." "You haven't the foggiest, but I know someone who might." Both twins broke into wicked grins. Mischief managed. Hermione was waiting in the chair where they'd left her when the Weasley twins ran back down the stairs. "You have us at a loss, Miss Granger," one of them said. "Even we do not know what is above the Great Hall. Something we thought was impossible." "Oh, all right then," Hermione said, disappointed. "You seem to have quite the knack for finding out things." "Though," the second twin said. She gave an equivocal nod. She thought that was far more down to everyone else's lack of curiosity. "If you should discover what is up there, we do hope you'll let us know. It's a rare treat to meet anyone who can compete with us on this sort of thing." "Thanks," she said. I'll keep that in mind." She was glad when they left her alone after that. She could appreciate the compliment, but she still didn't want their reputations rubbing off on her. As for searching for a way into the unknown space, she could try checking for doors in that part of the castle that led up, but it wouldn't be easy. She had the rest of the castle pretty well mapped out now and had been in all the other towers that weren't off limits, but that was mostly from asking the older students how to get places. There were so many hidden doors and doors that were really walls just pretending in Hogwarts that it would be hard to find a new place that nobody knew about. And in the meantime, with her mapping efforts, she hadn't kept up with her calculus studies as well as she'd intended, not to mention trying to get to know her fellow students. Maybe it was time that she took a break from her exploring, she thought.